His name was Lev. He sat behind a table collecting money. All day long, that's what he did. Just sat behind the table waiting for people to bring him money. He wasn't a businessman who gave people merchandise in exchange for their money. He wasn't a clerk at a 7-Eleven store standing behind a counter handing out cigarettes and soft drinks in exchange for people's money. He just sat behind his table and took the money and handed out receipts. Fishermen who had toiled hard all night on their feet, out on the lake, risking their lives, doing back-breaking work, would come ashore with their catch. If they sold the rewards of their sweat and good fortune for $100, they couldn't take it all home with them. First, they had to go over to Lev's place and line up in front of his table, waiting their turn to give him 6 or 7 of their hard-earned dollar shekels. The Roman tax on produce was only 5%, but every tax collector worth his salt knew how to tack on a little extra surcharge, an extra percentage point or two, to enrich himself. And what did people get in exchange for the money they gave Lev? Not even a smile, not even a thank you. And Lev could just sit there 6 days a week, taking in the money, growing fat and lazy, profiting from other people's hard work. Well, that was enough to make his neighbors hate him and the local preachers condemn him. But there was something worse yet about Lev. He was a collaborator with the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. Maybe you've seen documentaries, as I have, of events that took place back in 1944, 1945, when cities in France were liberated from Nazi control by Allied troops. Most of the French people rejoiced, but there were some who were not happy. The opportunists who had cooperated fully with the Nazis. Now they were condemned as collaborators, and justice became, very quick from their neighbors, often in the form of a noose around the neck or a bullet in the forehead. Well, yes, Lev was a collaborator, but the army of occupation was still in control, so he was safe from revenge for the time being, but not safe from his neighbor's resentment. Lev's tax table made him wealthy, but at the expense of the town's respect. Some would say at the very cost of his own soul. The tax table where he sat day after day raking in the money separated him from his community, from his religion, and if he were to believe the teachings of the religious authorities, even from his God. It can't have been a very satisfying life. Lev. We usually call him Levi, Levi Matthew, or just Matthew. Lev lived 2,000 years ago, but people still face the same sort of dilemma he faced. The choice between making a lot of money or living a satisfying life. Perhaps you're facing that dilemma. A pile of money or a satisfied life? Well, Valerie Young, publisher of the Changing Course newsletter, shared the dilemma insightfully recently in an essay. Let me read a couple of portions to you. My nephew Jason was pretty excited about starting college. Do you have any idea what you'd like to do when you graduate? I asked. Something in the sciences, he said, adding, and where I can make a lot of money. Is that all? I asked. Well, Jason paused for a moment before replying, well, I just hope I can find a job I don't hate too much. Smile. Time for a little auntie to nephew pep talk. You have your whole life to look forward to, I said. Don't you think that you should shoot higher than just short of miserable? Jason looked confused. What should I be shooting for? Well, clearly I was going to have to spell it out. A satisfaction, fulfillment, meaning, happiness. By the look on my dear nephew's face, I knew he wasn't buying it. This got me to thinking about the great debate raging in the hearts and minds of many working adults today. Money versus happiness. You see, publisher Valerie Young shares a modern perspective on Levi Matthews' dilemma, something crucial for today. She uses a powerful metaphor later in the essay when she calls a good salary and a retirement plan golden handcuffs that shackle people to unsatisfying jobs and stress-filled lives. Day after day, Matthew sat behind that table, that golden table. In my mind's eye, I can see the legs of that table turning to gold, golden bars that imprisoned Matthew in an ever-darkening dungeon of disillusionment and despair. And no one who came to that table left wishing him, have a nice day. No. Everyone looked at him with hatred, wishing he'd curl up and die so they wouldn't have to part with their hard-earned money. Matthew's office, his tax booth, became a vortex of despair and darkness, sucking the life and joy out of all who came there, and most of all, out of Matthew himself. But his booth was near enough to the shore that he could observe what was happening down by the Sea of Galilee. And suddenly, one day, people began coming by with smiles on their faces. Why, some even smiled at him. And then there was the lame beggar who hobbled down to the dock one morning and in the afternoon came running up the street laughing and smiling and singing and shouting the praises of God. He even stopped and did a little jig, whirling dance of joy right in front of Matthew's table. I mean, you couldn't help but notice that kind of thing. The whole atmosphere of Capernaum was changing. Fewer people shook their fists and glared at Matthew when they saw him on the street. There seemed to be a sunlit spot somewhere down by the lake where people's lives were being changed, recharged, and filled with joy. Well, soon Matthew discovered that at the center of that sunlit spot stood a man whose life radiated joy and healing, forgiveness, and satisfaction even more powerfully than Matthew's life reeked of illness, unforgiven debts, and frustration. There came a day when Matthew slipped out from behind his table just for a few moments and went over to listen. The teacher spoke of love, kindness, and forgiveness. Words that floated out on the fresh spring air like butterflies in happiness. They almost brightened even Matthew's face. But then he realized that such things were not for him. Forgiveness was for the righteous, those who devoted their lives to memorizing and reciting the law, not for the likes of him, not for sinful, despised, outcast tax collectors. The smile that had toyed with the corners of his mouth flitted away, and Matthew trudged back to his little booth behind the golden bars of his tax table and sat down once again in the dark dungeon of despair. Head hanging, he hardly noticed the excitement that began to brew around his booth, but when he did look up, he discovered that the teacher had followed him. The teacher was standing at his tax table. And suddenly the atmosphere of that dark vortex of despair seemed changed, recharged, filled with light and happiness. He looked up into the teacher's face, and the teacher returned his gaze And then he spoke 2 words to Matthew. Follow me. Follow me? How could a sinner like me follow a teacher of righteousness like you? Why does he want me to come with him? I am so far from God. And the questions tumbled through Matthew's mind, but all seemed to be answered in a microsecond in the smile and wide open arms of the man who invited him. None of the questions, none of the doubts, none of the despair had any relevance anymore. The teacher had invited him. The teacher had accepted him. The teacher wanted him. Mark chapter 2:14. And Levi rose and followed him. There was joy in Matthew's heart. And there was joy in Jesus' heart. Joy that would soon overflow in a celebration, in a party so big that it would shake the foundations of the city. We'll consider Matthew's celebration party in our next devotional. But before we do, friend, take a minute to think about yourself in relation to Matthew's story. Where are you in relation to Jesus, in relation to God? Is there something that is imprisoning you, keeping you from him, your office, your life? Does it seem somehow like a dark dungeon? If so, Jesus wants to bring his light and his joy in. He wants to break the bars that imprison you. He comes to you today, like he did to Matthew so many years ago, and says, follow me.